quick announcements. A few quick announcements, and then we will turn it over to Tony.
Thanks, Stephen. So just a couple of COVID-related things that I wanted to draw people's attention to. First of all, that there is a provincial mandate for masking. So the expectation is that everyone in the church will be masked. And I'm aware that, that presents enforcement challenges because it's very difficult to ask someone who doesn't want to comply to comply. So if you're having challenges around that, please reach out to us and we'll do what we can to try to support you in that. But it is the law. And so we need to make sure that we're asking people to do that as we engage in worship together. We're not suggesting if places are open and you feel comfortable staying open, you need to stay at a third of capacity. And so we will encourage you to manage that as well. But if you're not open, it's probably not a time to take that step. So probably encouraging those places who have continued online and live stream to continue to do that until this fourth wave is a little more under control. And as always, we're all here. If you've got questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us around that, and we will we'll be happy to help in whatever way we can. And the vaccine passports don't apply to public worship. I have had some questions about whether or not you can ask for them anyway. The advice that we're getting is that that's difficult to enforce. So the Toronto is not suggesting that we go down that road. But if a congregation does want to do that, we would just encourage you to get a bit of legal advice first before you do that, to make sure that you have the policies in place so that you can back yourself up if you get any challenges in that area. And we can help you talk through that if you need to.
A question, Trina, related to that.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand not going there. However, what is the feeling about someone who is unvaccinated, preparing the elements for communion and leading a service?
So at the moment, there's no requirement for staff or volunteers in leadership capacity to be vaccinated. Again, that would be a board decision. So the board could decide that if someone's in leadership that they would require them to be vaccinated. But we don't have any kind of public mandate that requires that at this point.
Thank you.
Whatever you do, just layers of protection. So make sure people are masking, make sure they're using their hand sanitizer, make sure they're keeping social distance. The more layers of protection that you can put in place, the safer your community will be. So I really don't want to take away from Tony's time. So if he finishes early, we can certainly come back to this. But in the meantime, I want to just turn things over to Tony to help us engage in conversation about this important day in the history of the folks of Alberta, and just as an important part of our work and commitment to reconciliation. Thank you, Tony, for being here and for offering leadership today.
Thank you. I'm going to do a bit of a presentation here, and then we will invite Alyssa to speak to some of the work that we're doing in terms of a Chinook Winds region toolkit for an Ally Toolkit around some of the work that we have done and some of the best practices of that to help guide others and to be a resource to the ministry. This is something that is grassroots driven, and I wanted to have people who were involved for a number of years in the Right Relations group to have a say and to be able to spearhead some of this. So this is a very exciting thing that we're doing. And we're also working with an Indigenous women's activist group to help us to develop one for missing and murdered Indigenous women. So there's a number of ways that we can do outreach and that we can perform ministry that is involved and engaged with the community. So now I'm going to begin, as we do, with a smudge to offer prayer and cleansing, direction, and a good mind to the work that we are doing and why we are gathered here, some of the discussions that we will have, and the difficulties around some of these conversations for people, for the church, and for others. Just to remember that we do this in a way that is to be helpful, to be nurturing, to respect one another's opinion and views, and to be mindful of our history, what comes about here, and what we've been working on for the past number of decades for the reconciliation work that began with the apology in 1986. Offer a prayer this time in my language. Om Jagezi Twan Jesus Christ. Bhagavakan Vahugu Harichin Rizimuri Sabitan. Agahas Naguchadna Ejia. Greater God, merciful one, one who is always with us, walks with us in creation. You who brought us here, we give thanks in all these things. We remember that we are children of this creation. We are part of the world around us, and that we have responsibilities to that world. As we step into this time of recognition of treaty, we also recognize that you, as a guiding light, was there for all of us, for the church as an advisor, for the crown as an entity that came into this land, and for the Indigenous people who have a deep connection to you and the places on this earth that resound with your impression, your spirit, your love. And all these things, we know our dealings are through you, with the hope that we might learn to live in a better way together in and amongst creation and all its facets. And this we give prayer. Amen. Thank you for that. I'm always mindful that in our tradition to do the smudge is a gift, because for many years we were not allowed to do that. And so also to be mindful of some of the relationships that have been broken by them in our families, in our communities, and in our ways of practice. What I'd like to do now is I have an orange candle here. I'd just like to light that for the children who never came home, the children who were victims of the residential school process, who were taken from their families, made to live in substandard conditions in many cases, and live their life in fear and turmoil. And so we see the repercussions of that in the finding of graves on the different residential school sites and in other parts of the communities throughout the country. And so we remember them. Remember that this time of year, the Reconciliation Day coming, that's really a focus around Orange Shirt Day and the loss of life, the loss of opportunity, the loss of livelihood, the loss of culture for many elders, many people who survived, and those that did not. And so we give thanks for that, for their struggle and their willingness to speak truth, especially at a time like now. We honor them with that candle lighting. Yes, if you want to put your name in the chat, we can, where everyone is from, your community of faith, your pronouns, and your treaty area you come from, because some of us are from different treaty areas in the Chinook Winds region. We'll go over that a bit. What I'd like to do after you've got your names into the chat, I will find it. I'm going to ask a series of questions. So I'll just pull up this PowerPoint. Great, thank you for all those. Thank you for coming. Thanks for all of you for taking part today. It's an important day, but one that we haven't given much notice to in our past few years, and something that I've continually tried to bring to the forefront. It's a great opportunity. I thank Karina for the opportunity to take time during this town hall to speak to some of these relational emphasis, especially around the Indigenous ministry, how we all come to the work of reconciliation and the work of the church. Okay, so the first question, I'm just going to barrel ahead here, opening prayer, introduction, and first question here for everyone. I expect you to all put fives up. How familiar are you with Indigenous history? And just be honest, number one is not very aware, and number 5 is very aware, and I'll test you later. And if you can actually just jot this down on a sheet of paper. We're not going to reveal the answers or responses unless you want to put them in the chat. Second question, how familiar are you with Indigenous spirituality? So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not very familiar and 5 being very familiar. And this is to gauge where we're at in our understanding for and kind of position us as we step into this space. Have you been to a reserve, participated in a ceremony or Sundance, a feast or a powwow? The answer is just yes or no. And our last question here, have you read the calls to the church from the caretakers of the Indigenous Circle, the elders of the caretakers of the Indigenous Circle? Yes or no? Okay. And we'll set that aside for the moment. Part of this discussion is around the treaty relationship, the history of the treaty in our area, and the histories that affect our region as a whole. So I've done a bit of a compilation of the material that I'll go over hopefully quickly, and then we'll have time for questions and response. Begin with the Treaty 7 land acknowledgement. I am from Treaty 7, and my ancestors wrote or were signatories to the Treaty 7 document. My family specifically were one of the signers of that treaty document. And so when I begin an acknowledgement or when I begin a understanding, it's often important to position ourselves, to have that sort of standpoint reflection on there. We acknowledge all perspectives here. If you come from other lands, welcome. You're a part of our treaty story. I am a descendant of the signers of Treaty 7. If you come from here or were born here, we welcome you as well into this treaty relationship. You're the recipient of the legacy of your ancestors. As our guest, we welcome you into these lands given to us by Creator. As a guest, you hold certain rights and responsibilities to the treaty relationship. But remember that in these lands in 1877, a great peace was made between the people of the Nakota-Iyathyabi, the Niitsitapi, and Tsuut'ina people, with the British Crown and the Church who urged this peace. A promise was made that we might live together in blessing and harmony sharing resources and wisdom. We recognize the Métis people also became part of the story and the sharing. Sadly, the promises made at treaty never came to pass. And today we live with the outcomes of those choices, like the discoveries of the mass graves uncovered in Kamloops Indian Residential School, and the discoveries yet to come. For those that come from other places, other histories, histories of slavery, histories of displacement, histories of refugee resettlement and persecution, we welcome you to this land of peace. You are honored guests. May you find healing and recovery here. Our destinies tied into one on this land are tied into one on this land. May we learn to live in peace together. As we step into this history, I'm just going to give an overview here of the treaties of Canada. And this is the Historical Treaties from the Government of Canada website. You will notice large portions of the country that are under treaty, some portions that are not. You will notice that in the east, we have peace and friendship treaties. And these were made in the Acadia area. These were made prior to Confederation. These were the earliest forms of treaty making. As we move into the west, you see in Ontario and the beginnings of the treaty process, we oddly have 1871, the treaty number 1 made in Manitoba. And so this was triggered by the signing of Confederation, the adoption of BC into the process. So as a member of one of the states of Canada. And so the province of BC had a stipulation that they wanted to have connection to the eastern side of the country. They wanted that through a railroad. And so they signed into Confederation in 1871. We'll go over that a bit later. And so the treaty making process began to facilitate that development of a railway all the way through. So we have in 1, 2, and 3 in quick succession, we have Treaty 4 at the bottom there. And then we move up to different treaties. Treaty 5, there's 2 areas of Treaty 5, 1875 and 1908. Later, the Treaty number 6 area going to the north. That's because they thought they would be going north with the railway over into the Rocky Mountain House area, but they ended up going straight across the prairies to the Rogers Pass area and had to make treaty number 7 at the bottom. So you see, and then after the Treaty 7 was signed, it drops off into later amalgamations of the treaty process. So 1889 is the next treaty. And then it goes until 1929 over here down at the bottom. And you'll find different records and different times that these treaty making processes have occurred. During this turn of the century time, that's when we start to get the treaties of Williams treaties and the treaties around Toronto. We get Treaty number 13 and other areas there. The Upper Canada, Lower Canada land surrenders and the storing up of land title to the people who had property, who were building houses and all that sort of thing. Didn't have a clear, not a mandate, but a clear authority to do that. So they needed to do this through the treaty process. Here, I'm just outlining the treaty process and the dates and the configuration of the dates that happened and where they happened. So the treaty process for us begins Treaty 4, the date 1874 in Fort Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan. So treaty number 4 is primarily a Saskatchewan treaty. There's a sliver into Alberta. Treaty number 5 comes after that. I just wanted to include that in terms of where the treaty making process was going. So up here we have Barons River in 1875, the treaty making process taking place up there. Treaty number 6 at Fort Carleton, Saskatchewan. The treaty number 6 takes a long time through this process because they're moving to various areas. And even after this date, there are adhesions to the treaty. So areas that were not included that become included in the treaty. Treaty number 7, signed at Blackfoot Crossing in 1877 on September 22nd, that's today. Treaty number 8, up in Lesser Slave Lake in 1899. Here, I just made a note, BC joined Canada as the country's 6th province on 20 July 1871. So as we look at this map, we'll see Treaty 6 here, another element of Treaty 6 here, which was more of an adhesion. Treaty 10, Treaty 5 has 2 dates there. And so, and Treaty 6 has a number of adhesions within their development so that many tribes were involved at different times. And so ours is fairly easy for Treaty 7. It is the 7 nations, each independent nation. Bearspaw, Chinook, and Wesley comprise the Stoney Nations. Siksika, Piikani, Kainai also comprise the Niitsitapi or Blackfoot Confederacy nations, and the Tsuut'ina are a separate nation that belong in large part in their language and culture to the Dene up in the north, and are part of that remnant here, and also connected to the Dine, D-I-N-E, in the south, who are the Navajo people. They all speak the same language and have a similar culture. Here is treaty number 6. I'm going backwards on this just to show the extent of these treaties. Treaty number 6 has the adhesions and the different groups that were involved. Here, Treaty 6 nations in Alberta that we know, here in listed. And the one that we are involved with primarily for the Indigenous Church, Samson Cree Nation, and Goodfish, Lifefish, and Saddle Lake First Nation. Here we see all of the nations, 29 nations that belong to Treaty 6 in the Saskatchewan area. Move on to the next treaty area. Treaty number 4. So this has 56 First Nations. In this portion throughout Saskatchewan, there's this small sliver in Alberta that nobody lives in, because this used to be, there's a group here called the, looking for it, they're a Stoney Nation, and they were in that area, and that's the holy area for the Stoney people. It is the Lean Man, what am I saying? I think I might have moved it out. So I'll fix that later. But the Mosquito First Nation, Lean Man First Nation, they were moved from this area, much like a Trail of Tears movement, resettlement, moved into the North Battleford area. And along that trail, they lost a lot of elders and a lot of children, burials, people that were left behind for that move. This is treaty number 7. In this document, you will see the 2 missionaries, Constantine Skolin, who was a priest with the Catholic Church, who was an advocate for a particular group of the Blackfoot Kainai, who worked with them to get them included into this and got their agreement to be part of this treaty. You also have John McDougall, who was the missionary at Morley, who brought the Stoney people, the Nakota people, into this treaty. And so at the time, not all of these guys were getting along. The treaty was set up at Blackfoot Crossing, which is in kind of the valley area. And you had cannons set up on the hills surrounding that area in case anything went wrong. You have the Stoney people who were set in a camp on the other side of the valley in one of the clearing areas there, and they would send an emissary to the treaty negotiation. And for the John McDougall, who spoke Cree, he would relate images back, details back and forth. And so when it came time to treaty signing, just the chief and particular people that are named here came and put their X on the document. And then they disbanded that gathering. Here are images of Treaty Number 6, Treaty Number 7, elders and people that from this area. This is from the Tsuut'ina people. Here we have gatherings of people at Treaty Number 4 and Treaty Number 8. And as you can see, it is a small gathering of officials and leaders from the Indigenous communities. There are very little women in any of these discussions and negotiation. A lot of the rights of women were not recognized. So the importance of the treaty is that it added recognition to the sovereignty of the nations. It established rights like the right to self-governance. These are things that you have to have if you are going to sign a treaty. If you are going to take part in treaty making, you need to have the authority to do it. You need to have the land base. You need to have the right to do it. So that's what we talk about when we talk about affirming established rights. So then there's status of nations that come together that are formally kind of recognized as nations. Before that, most of the nations were large family groups and who had family interests in these areas like trap lines and hunting areas and gathering areas. And then you have Aboriginal title, which is the recognition of land and territory-based rights, as well as Aboriginal self-governance within those rights. And so all of these things were outside of the treaty because the treaty was primarily focused on land, a land transaction. But all of this positioning comes before that and helps to foster some of the commitments and the negotiation, the promises that were made and related in our oral tradition, related in some narratives from others who were present and others that spoke out after a time. But for the most part, whatever was put on paper what held the day. What claims around specific rights or specific promises that were made were not accepted because they were not part of the written text of what we had. And yet they brought the written text out from the central government and nothing, they never changed the document. They just had people put their X on it. It was pre-written. So here, here we talk about the centenary of the Treaty Number 7 in 1977. The medallions that were given out, our family has a few of those. And because we signed the treaty originally and then we re-signed the treaty under my father in 1977 at Blackfoot Crossing. This picture below is a picture of Queen Elizabeth and my father in his headdress. And this is at Buckingham Palace. This is the meeting of my father and others that went to England, that went to meet the Queen, to invite her to the Centenary and to have her take part in those ceremonies. Here in the next picture is Prince Charles. Prince Charles came and took part in her stead and representing the crown and did ceremony there with the people. So I have a bit of a video here. Well, it's after this, sorry. So, recapping the history here, we have the Iron Confederacy, which was the Indigenous covenant made with the Crees as they came into our territory, as they came into the plains. And so in the 1700s, an agreement was struck that they would be allies. And so this was the continuation of that. We also have a similar compact with the Shuswap area, so the Kamloops people. They have an agreement with the Stoney people to say that we will exchange and be partners and interchange and intermarry. So this is an important part of the way that we do peacemaking, because when we think about what happened, the history of Bear Hills in just south of Edmonton. The Bear Hills were created, the significance of that area was created because there was a peace that was made between the Blackfoot people and the Cree people. And to solidify that peace, they exchanged children, and the children would grow up in either community. And so in doing that, they eliminated the ability to fight one another. And so this is the kind of thinking that goes into how we perform peace, how we understand relationship, and how we understand our connection to one another. And so if we embed our people in another group, then there's less chance of animosity and less chance of long-term pain and long-term violence. In 1763, we had the Royal Proclamation, which was set about the rights of Indigenous people in a way that said, you cannot take up the rights, the lands of Indigenous people without making a treaty with them. And this is because in examples like Pontiac's Rebellion, after the 7 Years' War, the French surrendered. The French started giving up their rights to title and land. Their allies did not agree. So the Indigenous people from the various parts, the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, and others, took part in a rebellion that ended up burning down 8 of the British forts. And so in doing that, the government of the British government said, okay, well, because of land being taken up and because of this violence, we are fixing that by including the provision that we would have to make a treaty. As we move ahead, in the 1850s, I've written here that they will act to protect Indians, which is quite a misnomer. The act created Indian status. The act created what we could call an Indian in British law. And so part of this act was to separate those that could be called Indian, those that could be called from the nations and from the tribes, versus others who may have been born with both DNA of the settlers and of the Indigenous people. So there became this want to exclude people. And also the act to encourage civilization of Indian tribes began in 1857, which was an assimilation policy. So this was all before Confederation. So Confederation, 1867, and BC joins in 1871. Then we start having the numbered treaties. The numbered treaties were starting to put in place. In the middle of that, we have the Indian Act that was enacted in 1876, a year before we signed treaty. So you see all this bad faith negotiation, bad faith argument around why we are trying to work together and whose interests are being commemorated when we talk about some of these acts. And so in the Indian Act, Reverend John McDougall was an advisor to the Stoney Methodist Church representative, later became the United Church. He was an agent of the government, especially in Treaty 6 and in Treaty 7. Francis, Father Constantine Scollin was a Blackfoot Band's advisor. He was an unpaid consultant to the government. He was also took part in Treaty 6 and Treaty 7. You have signatures of both of them in the documents. We want to talk a little bit about treaty implementation, the settlement, assimilation, and displacement.
There has been no...
Sorry, I'm going to go back. And I'll start that. This is a video, and I'm going to have to get you to turn your volume up because I think volume is not great. But this is a 1970s video that was done by the Stoney people and is part of the commemoration of the signing of Treaty Number 7. And so there are important portions in here, I think, that speak to some of the words that I've offered, but kind of give an affirmation of that through this video.
There has been no single event in our history to match the importance of Treaty 7.
Let me stop this. I want to see if I put the volume.
It came through pretty well with the volume, Tony.
Yeah, I'm having an issue hearing because I have it way up on mine and I'm getting a very low sound. So I'm going to just play it and share it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Single event in our history to match the importance of Treaty 7.
Today we're reliving the year of 1877 when the Treaty 7 was signed by our forefathers.
On July 6, 1977, at Blackfoot Crossing, Alberta, the chiefs and councillors of the Blackfoot, Blunt, Piegan, Sarcee, and Stoney peoples gathered to meet with His Highness Prince Charles.
To our world visitors, this is the living color of our
We joined to reenact the signing of Treaty Number 7 100 years before.
Move back.
When we came to make treaty in 1877, there were 5,000 Indians and only a handful of government officials and policemen. The Stonies were a branch of the Sioux Nation, one of the 5 tribes speaking 3 different languages that were included in this treaty.
I can't.
Our forefathers came to sign a peace treaty between nations equally, and we promised that we would be friendly and respectful of the white settlers that were coming to share our land. We had long ago separated into 3 bands, the Wesley Band, the Bearspaw Band, and the Chiniki Band. Our home was in the foothills to the west. Our missionary told us the Europeans loved us as their brothers and would protect us if we signed the treaty. The treaty promised to protect our culture and instead exploited our trust. No one anywhere could predict how our histories would evolve. The ambitious immigrants came and kept coming. Soon the hunting was gone. The laws made us trespassers. We were forced to get written permission to leave the reserve. We had lived here forever, it seemed, and never drew a line and said that you cannot go here or there. We didn't understand that by offering to share our land with the Europeans, we were surrendering our land and our way of life. At the original ceremonies, we were promised one reserve for each of our 3 bands. But after the surveyors marked out the first one at Morley, they never came back. And all of us were forced to live on land meant for 1/3 of our people. We were honored to have Prince Charles come to visit us at Morley, 30 miles west of Calgary.
It says, in memory of one brave Stony who gave his life during World War II to maintain the peace that was first promised to his people at Treaty Number 7, 100 years ago, and dedicated in my presence.
That is the portion that I stopped the video at.
There has been...
So just a quick recap of what happened after the Indian Act came in. Restricted access to lands, breaking up of lands, paternalism and patriarchy. We had a lot of gender discrimination. The women who had, especially in our matriarchal societies, lost all their rights, and they lost status if they married outside of the nation. And so all of these things quickly led to a dissolution, imbalance of power, and a dissolution of rights for many. There was a compulsory enfranchisement. You lost your status if you had an education, if you did military service, and if you voted. And so these slowly became dissolved over time, but at the outset, that was the intention of the Indian Act. So there were forced removal of people from towns. You couldn't go into the town unless you had a permit. There was a pass system that was put in place, and you needed passes to leave the reserve, to go into the States and go to other places. My father went to the university or the Cook Christian Training School at Tempe, Arizona, needed a pass to leave the reserve in order to do that. Otherwise, he would have lost his status as an Indian person when he was trying to get ordained. And the prohibition of ceremonies, the prohibition of the way that we have been able to preserve some of our ceremonies. And so things like the Banff Indian Days were critical to our people, because that allowed us to at least practice, only in this carnivalesque type form, but it maintained some of the integrity of the culture and the belief systems. I'll touch briefly on residential schools. This is something that we'll continue to work toward next week when we have the Truth and Reconciliation Day. The Truth and Reconciliation Day specifically identifies this residential school information, and as the precursor, the Orange Shirt Day was dedicated to the history and the stories and the impacts of the residential school on people, the intergenerational trauma and other aspects of it. Here we have in 1878 to 1887, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald was the Prime Minister and also Minister of Indian Affairs. And so created in large part through his own initiative, the effects that we see in the Indian Act. So here, 1897, we have the Davin Report, which suggested an aggressive civilization policy. This forced a lot of the assimilation mandates within the Indian Act. We also have the peasant farm policy, which took away mechanized equipment from the reserves. So when they did farming, they couldn't use the tractors and all the other implementations that white farmers could. So they were not as competitive. Here also we have Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the superintendent from 1913 to 1932, who forced the residential school agenda upon the nations. 1920, residential schools became mandatory, but tellingly, and even after the Duncan Campbell Scott timeframe, 1935 was the date that they required schools to put on a registry list the names of the children who died, who they buried in their area. So a lot of the areas before that, before 1935, the mass graves that we see, there was no requirement to record that anywhere. Here is a list of the residential schools in the Treaty 7 area. This is the Anglican schools, the Catholic schools, and here the Methodist schools that became property through the transition into the United Church of Canada. So the McDougall Day School, the McDougall Orphanage and Training School, the residential school run by the Methodist Church. We also have the Red Deer Industrial School, a Methodist school in Red Deer. That was one of the most brutal schools that had a lot of deaths. And when we look at that in light of what we see from Kamloops, so that and in other places is a reason for the outrage that we see coming from Indigenous communities. We also have people that were sent to Edmonton Industrial School, and from the Stony Resort, and people sent to Fort Capel and other areas of Canada. This is the Morley Orphanage and Residential School, and the Dunbow in Calgary residential school close to the Tutina or the Highwood River. Here we have Old Sun, Siksika, and we have St. Mary's in Kainai. And so when I look at St. Mary's, I always think of, especially with these fences and stuff, I always think of the places in Germany, part of the Holocaust. And when you start to think about what had happened, what happened to these children, thinking along those terms. Here, just in discussion, where do we go now? Where have we been? This I've shown many times, and here I just want to highlight Alberta Billy's response, where he stood up before the leaders of the United Church and asked the church to apologize for the Native people for what you did to them in residential school, and that was in 1981. That triggered the apology that later came, and the apology had a response. The response to the apology was that it was not accepted, but acknowledged, affirmed, as it said in the document, the 1988 response, with the expectation that the church would try to walk a more faithful path. We pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity. We had a statement from Mrs. Edith Memnook from the Saddle Lake Preserve. And still through this, these last portions at the end, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings came out in 2015. The TRC calls to action were adopted by the United Church in 2015. UNDRIP was adopted 2016. And the calls to the church adopted 2018. And here, the work that continues, the day school survivors, the 60th Truth, the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, and the foster care system, the plight of the children today. So these issues still continue on today. There's much to do. I'm gonna maybe turn this to Alyssa for a second to talk about the Ally Toolkit. I've only got a couple of slides in here from your presentation, so, and then we'll talk about the upcoming opportunities. So Alyssa, if you want to join in or just stop the share. Well, actually, you can talk over these. I think that would.
Sure. Yeah, so a project that a few people, mostly from Hillhurst, have been working on this summer is pulling together a toolkit that really sort of pulls together some of the best resources that we've seen that have helped in the right relations work that we're doing or reconciliation work. The idea behind it is kind of multifold. It's connected to one of the TRC calls to action that says we call upon church parties to the settlement agreement to develop ongoing education strategies to ensure that their congregations learn about their church's role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, and why the apologies were necessary. And I think in the work the church has been doing, or a lot of times we've found some really great resources that have been helpful and want to find good ways to share them, and realize that it's not just what we're saying, but we've really chosen to focus on Indigenous voices, and especially voices from Treaty 7, and recognizing the importance of connection to place in Indigenous worldview. And not all of the resources that we've collected are from just from Treaty 7. There are some from other areas as well, but we've really tried to highlight some of the areas from Treaty 7. And so, yeah, we've pulled together a lot of resources, but realized that can also be overwhelming. And so we've divided them into 10 right now, thematic areas that each look at a different concept or idea that's connected. So you can see one of them is the true history of Canada and Indigenous people. Their other ones include importance of land. Another is language and culture and community engagement. We have, I think, 4 that are on specific issues. So one being residential schools and the TRC, another being missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And they're kind of some of the main issues and concepts that we think are important to this work and that people need to continue to learn about and continue to develop. So for each of them right now, where we're at is we sort of developed the 10 themes and a bit of an introduction that Tony showed for some of them that are there. And then as well as a list. Yeah, great, Tony. If you could maybe just scroll down to the first one. Within each theme, we've shared a brief introduction to the theme, and then sort of collated the resources to have a short list, normally 3 to 4 resources that we consider sort of must read, must watch resources that we think everybody should look at. They're typically a bit shorter, more introductory, and then a longer list of sort of diving deeper resources for people who want to go further, want to expand their understanding more. And each resource has a description attached to it, as well as some tags. So some of them we've tagged as children or youth resources that are good for children or youth, Treaty 7, resources developed by the United Church of Canada or about the United Church of Canada. And then ones with actions associated them where people can actually do something or take an action that's connected. So yeah, this is some of the work we've been doing over the summer. I think we have a few different ideas of where this could go, potentially looking at, developing like a workshop around each of these where we'd ask people maybe to do the must read watch in advance and then come maybe filming those and making them a resource that's available. We also want to do a bit more work on sort of getting other people's feedback and input into the resources that are there, seeing maybe we're missing some that are really important. And then getting feedback. We'd also like to put it in a format that is very engaging, and that sort of brings people in. It doesn't feel just like a 12-page document or report that you have to read through, but really does sort of foster engagement and potentially with some additional quotes or pictures or photos or graphics that really bring people in. So those are all some of the conversations that we're continuing to have around this. And I think one of the reasons, and Tony asked to share it today, is to sort of also start sort of opening it up and seeing if anyone else is interested in being part of creating this alongside with us, potentially looking at maybe having some additional meetings or workshops to really push it forward and make it a tool that would be useful, not just for our church, but for other churches as well, and see where it can go. Anything else, Tony, I'm missing?
Well, that's fine. And thank you. And for the invitation that will be open, we'll send that out to people that they can get involved. We'll have that listed in the newsletter that goes out, and just to make sure that there's opportunity there for people to participate in some of this work and to feel that they're part of it, and to be encouraged to always listen to what we're kind of engaged with, and how we want to live into our TRC commitments and other things. So I'm just going to close off here and with this upcoming opportunities and things that we're going to be doing. Truth and Reconciliation Day, a regional commemorative service on YouTube at noon, an ecumenical Indigenous clergy panel from members of the Lutheran, Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church will have Mark McDonald, the Indigenous bishop, taking part. My brother John will be there for the United Church, and it's on the Baptist Church. I'm also looking for a representative from the Presbyterian Church as well. Next, we'll have the Indigenous Day of Wellness for Women that we want to have just for those that are going through a hard time, wanting to have some spiritual care and space to reflect upon their losses and things that have happened. Sisters in Spirit Day will have a memorial service on October 3rd at 2 p.m. Sisters in Spirit Day itself on October 4th, there will be vigils and online vigils with NWAC, the National Women's Association, Indigenous Women's Association. And with Awaton in Calgary, they're having their 14th annual Olympic Plaza vigil at noon on October 4th. That's the idea of what can we do on Truth and Reconciliation Day. Wear your orange shirts, Sunday, September 26th and September 30th. Read the apologies and the response. Read the TRC calls to action. Read the calls to the church. And there are other activities like the one we saw most recently online from Orangeville, Ontario, a teaching of the 7 grandfather teachings, and doing things like this crosswalk with the 7 feathers on it to represent those teachings. So that's all that we have for today. I'll turn it back over to the rest of you so that you can complete. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. That was really a helpful presentation, and I really appreciate it. I just wonder before we close off if folks have any questions.
It all sunk right in.
I have a question.
Okay.
I noticed on the map for Quebec, there were no treaties or perceived treaties. What is the history with respect to Quebec?
Clear about the history in Quebec. There is, after Confederation, the James Bay, other treaties that were worked through. They're modern day treaties. You didn't see either, so those are modern day treaties. And those modern day treaties include a lot of different negotiations, so different emphasis on what rights are being put on the table, and how those are bound by federal law. So things that happen in the Supreme Court affect what those treaties look like today. So those are the other treaties that are not on that map. That's just the Canadian numbered treaties map that they put up.
I'm just wondering what your best advice is for educating the congregation. Like, I've been taking in information to the board, and that's as far as I got so far. So I'm wondering what other people found successful for educating more members in the congregations.
I think a lot of it has to do with discussion. A lot of it has to do with working together on projects and working with members, looking at how you're doing things like working with the local community, bringing that awareness into your congregations through talking to elders or talking to someone like me coming in, someone that can help and bridge some of those teachings and understand to tell why it's important. I know for the smaller communities, there's not a great deal of interaction with the Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations, the treaty areas, especially the reserves, because of things like trespassing and not being able to go into those areas. But there are ways, and especially we see within our urban communities where we have people in need. And so we respond to that by building the relationship. There's also that opportunity with the Indigenous nations.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everyone. This was a really wonderful and informative session. Tony, I'm wondering if you would mind just closing our time together with a prayer.
And people are welcome to come to the session tonight. We're going to talk about some of your right relations programs and how those can be built upon and how we can work together in networks to try to build our effectiveness as a church organization. Thank you to this time, Trina, and everyone for your attention, for staying for this portion. Let us pray. Greater God, thank you for this time. We know that the history is difficult and deep for the work that we are doing. And we know your guidance is there, your presence is there to help us go out into the world and do what needs to be done for our local communities, for our fellow citizens, for brothers and sisters and relatives. We know that you are in our hearts and will guide us with our best intentions forward. I pray that you help those in need, help those who require our assistance, be able to hear our voice, hear our song. Jesus Christ. Amen. Go in peace. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. And we do encourage you to come back this evening with Tony, and we'll keep you posted on other things that are coming and going in the region through our newsletter. So thanks again, Tony, and blessings to all of you. And Stephen asked me to pass along his greetings as well. He had a meeting at 3, so had to step out. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.